Welcome to the Podcast Interview Marketing Show. Today's a special one as we celebrate a full year of episodes, insights, and transformations. Now, I've got two incredible team members with me today. Tiffany Meenk is our marketing powerhouse, and Kristen Nolan is the organizational wizard behind the scenes. Over the last year, they've been instrumental in bringing this show to life and helping us refine the systems that make podcast interview marketing work. Today, we'll be pulling back the curtain to share the highs, lows, and everything we've learned about launching and maintaining a podcast that builds trust, attracts listeners, and grows our business. Whether you're thinking of starting a podcast, optimizing the one you already have, or even if you're just interested in becoming a better guest, this episode will help you avoid the pitfalls and take advantage of the lessons we've learned. So let's dive in and talk about what it really takes to make podcasting work for your brand. Welcome to episode 52 of the Podcast Interview Marketing Show. What a year it's been. We've learned a lot, the good, the bad, the ugly. And today I have two of the team members that have seen it all, and we're going to go behind the curtain, right? We're going to explain everything that we've learned on this, hopefully so that you don't have to go through the same. We've got Tiffany Meenk, who's our marketing manager here with us. We've also got Kristen Nolan, who's the administrative assistant. She's the one that keeps the trains on time here. So let me go to you first, Kristen. Look back on the last year. What was the biggest surprise that you had?
So I think the biggest surprise for me was, I usually in my role as a client account manager, I see things from a client perspective or a guest perspective. So seeing it from a hosting perspective was new for me. And I think sometimes we take for granted how much work is involved in scheduling and finding guests and putting together content and producing the episode. So for me, it was a really eye-opening experience about all the things that you have to do to make that happen and to make it happen in a way that, is consistent and, really shadows your, and shows off your brand.
Yeah, it's amazing all the things that could go wrong and trying to engineer those so they don't go wrong. And it's different, and there's a lot of magic that happens. And yeah, after 1,000 podcast guesting opportunities, being the host, that was new. Tiffany, how about same question to you? What was your biggest surprise?
Oh man, Tom, you're going to make me pick one. Let's start with getting off the ground. That initial, from start to finish, from those initial conversations of, hey, let's do this, to that first episode going live. That was probably a 4-5 month process, right? From that first meeting we had, brainstorming, coming up with the goal, our purpose, our intention with the show. Getting that all laid out. And then the biggest hang up being that approval from Apple, taking about, I think, 45 plus days. I was not expecting that at all to take that long, and you're just sitting there at their mercy. So that's probably something anybody else who's thinking of starting a show to bear in mind. If you have a hard deadline, I want this to launch around the launch of my book or an event. Keep that in mind. You might want to start a little earlier than you think you need to.
I think it was actually 90 days, or at least it's 90 days now, because we work with a lot of podcast production companies, and they call it phase 0, right? Somebody comes to them and says, I want to get going. Well, great. But currently it's taken like 90 days to get up on iTunes. So there's other things that they're doing there, going out and guesting. But yeah, one of our core beliefs, core Thomisms that we say around here is that patience is a virtue. It's not one we have. And I remember at the last summer at the leadership meeting saying, yep, we need to do the Podcast Interview Marketing Show and let's launch it. And so we started to do all of that foundational work, and then to realize there's only so much that we can do. We're at the mercy of the Apple gods on there, and it's not like you can call the customer support line and say, "Can we get this fast tracked?" It's like they get to it when they get to it.
Yeah, exactly. There's no customer support. It's you and a million other people, right? Probably waiting in that queue there. And so what it did give us though was more time to prepare and line up episodes. So on the back end, before people even knew we were launching this podcast, we were building up our episodes and content ideas. And it gave us more time on the back end to work out some scheduling kinks and things like that of just implementing a new workflow and work system into our existing business, right? Because there's a lot of moving parts to coming up with episode ideas, pacing those, scheduling them out, coordinating schedules between a guest and a host, coming up with ideas, all these things, creating the website for the show, creating the podcast, are all those things on the back end that you take. So maybe it was a blessing in disguise that we were able to come out the gate a little bit more prepared than maybe we had have been if we did get out in 30 days, right? So maybe there's the silver lining.
Yeah. And I think you touch on like the organizational perspective of it, right? Like, I think a lot of times, especially with people that I work with, there's an idea and you want to execute it very quickly. And as Tom, as you said, about patience. So I think it really is a situation where, going into it, having those expectations that it's not going to be that you have an idea today and you're producing your first episode on day 1 or day 2 or whatever that looks like for you. And so I love that you had talked about kind of all the things that go into it, because I think so often people don't think about that, right? Like they're like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to get it done, and I can produce an episode very quickly. And maybe you can, but is it quality? Is it what, is it what your brand is aligned with?
Yeah, that was my big concern. And I said, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it with excellence, because that's how we do everything here, right? I don't want to, this is our brand. People are going to see this. It's got to be done with excellence. And then, there's something called pod fade in the industry. And we've seen this. 80% of podcasts die within the first 10 episodes. And, I didn't want to be like that 80% where we're talking about it this quarter and it's like, oh, we've got a new podcast. And then a quarter from now, somebody asks, how's your podcast? And it's an embarrassment. So what did we have? I think we had 10 recorded or something like that before we actually pushed publish.
Which again, especially, it's bad for your brand in general, but especially when you are considered a category designer and the idea of podcast interview marketing, right? And being intentional in podcasting, it really would have been bad for our brand, I think. And it fit too with our business model. We are teaching people how to grow your business with podcast interview marketing, hence the name of the podcast. And now we're kind of practicing what we preach and showing in real time examples to our clients how to do it, how to leverage podcasts to grow your business. So I think that's been it's been a great experience. I'm excited here. I've done several episodes. I'm excited here to be recording number 53. It's like we made a milestone here, 1 full year of episodes.
So let's talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, right? The ugly stuff. What was most stressful to you in this last year?
I think it was really just identifying and evaluating the processes, right? Like we had some processes, I think early on, that made things a little bit more messy, right? Like when we talk about scheduling, we're not just talking about scheduling internally, we're talking about scheduling with outside people. And so really just having a good framework of what that looks like. So everyone's on the same page so that, when we're dealing with outside guests, we're making sure that it's a smooth situation for them, that they're not, that everything is good.
To piggyback off of Kristen, that keeping from the external guest perspective, not looking like we're dropping the ball, keeping them in the loop, from that initial conversation of inviting them to be on our show to having the talking points prepared, scheduling, all of that, coordinating with the guest and the host schedule, sending those emails, sending the reminder the day before, all of that you're implementing an entire new system into your business doing that. So I would say that's one. The other is also consistently being able to come up with fresh new content that your listeners are curious about, that is on brand, right? Is on topic, on in line with the goal and purpose of the show. And then finding guests to come to that, right? To a lot of times in our brainstorm sessions, we'll come up with ideas. Hey, we want to talk about AI, right? And so we look and say, who are leaders in that space? And then you have to identify some people, seek them out, get on their calendar. It's a process from start to finish of just brainstorming an idea. So that's been a challenge.
I was going to say the thing that gave me the stress or the gray hair was having to come out with an interview or a episode every week, right? And we're a remote team, right? And to be honest, Tiffany would jump through hoops at times, right? Because we'd get the episode done. I had to record the intro and the outro, and then Cameron, who does the editing, does a great job. And now he's doing it, right? And getting it to you. There were times where it was under, I'm going to say 24 hours. Maybe it was less than that before everything was ready to go. And by the grace of God and a lot of luck, we always got them out. But, it's like one internet problem, one hurricane, whatever it was, could have really caused that problem. So I felt so much better and slept better at night when all of a sudden before I went on sabbatical, it was like, oh, this is great. We were, whatever it was, 6 weeks ahead on all of the interviews. And I thought, this is great. And like so many other podcasts I've talked to, you think you're ahead, and then you come back and it's like, where did they all go? Right? Oh, over the holidays, people talk about that, over the summer. So really working ahead, that cuts down the pressure and the stress so much.
Yeah. And like, I know, in my role at like looking as a client account manager, looking at potential shows for my clients, consistency is key, right? If I go in and I see that a show doesn't produce consistent episodes, I'm like, that's not the show for my client. And so I think it's so important that you have the planning process where you're able to consistently produce an episode, and, really trying to have some backup episodes, right? As you mentioned, Tom, things go wrong. I live in Florida. We had 2 hurricanes. And so like back to back. So like I was out for like a week and a half and, all of that. And so things happen. And so I think it's really being proactive and being prepared, that no matter what kind of life throws your way, that you're able to do it. People are going to reschedule. Things aren't going to work out. So really just being organized and seeing ahead. And so I think as a team, we collectively tried to stay right around that 6 to 8 weeks ahead. And then as we noticed, we were sort of getting out of that. We were like, okay, we need to sort of ramp up again. So really, I think consistency and organization are really helpful.
And tying into that consistency of the show, I look back at our first 5 episodes compared to today. And one change that is probably the most drastic change that we're going to implement going into season year 2 here is having a consistent host. In the beginning, we collectively at Interview Ballet, this is a team group effort, right? If you elevate the business, you elevate the team, we're all one together. But what we found was having 5 or 6 hosts on your roster, while that's great that you always have somebody that you can pull up to bat, it almost put us at a disadvantage because they were only recording maybe once every month or 2, right? And you can't finesse it if you don't practice it more often. So that's why over time, gradually, we have roped Tom into being our more consistent, steady host. He far exceeds all of our time on podcast recordings, all of us combined.
Well, you forgot to come up with the idea of, or call out the person, I'll say idiot, that came up with this idea of like, let's have a different host every week, right? That was me. And, I love our team. My microphone makes me sound good. My team makes me look good. And it's like, yeah, let's have everybody host a different one. And to their credit, everybody said, sure. But I know how stressful it was for me to be a host. And then for them to do it, And like you said, do it once every 2 months. You never got comfortable with it. And so I think that consistency, I want to bring different voices in, but there's got to be one theme there. And so that was a major strategic flaw on my part. And the team did great on that, but I think there has to be that consistent voice. And I was talking to, big podcast producer the other day about that. And he's like, oh yeah, you could have understood that if you would have looked back at television. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? It's like Johnny Carson, right? Every night it was Johnny, right? And it was a long time before Jay Leno started to cover for him. And he'd been a guest there numerous times. And when there was a guest host, what was it? Ed McMahon, he was there a lot on the couch. So there was that consistency there. And I'm dating myself. Everybody's going, who's Johnny Carson? Who's Ed McMahon? But that consistency, that's what people come from, right? If there was a new cast every week at Seinfeld, nobody would be there. So that's something we're doing going forward. I want to have multiple voices there, but we're going to have more consistency in that.
Yeah. And I've been a host and I've been a guest, and I will tell you that being a guest is much easier than being a host, right? So you and I are having the conversation, and I often have these conversations with my clients as well. Lean into your strengths, right? If you're that super organized type A person, you want to kind of control the conversation, you need your own podcast. If you're more of the person that wants to have the conversation and I always tell my clients, I think the best podcast I listen to, it sounds like I'm in a coffee shop over, listening to a conversation right next to me of two people. And so I think, it's also, figuring out what works for you and leaning into that. And I just, and we've talked about it like on the team, right? There are some teammates that make great hosts. There are some teammates that make better guests. And so it's really just taking that into consideration when creating a podcast or being a guest.
Absolutely. I think back to my first recording. I think it's a great example. I'm not quite as experienced with public speaking as Tom, but he and I, I've done many live presentations, discussions, live streaming episodes, things like that. But going into hosting my first recording here on the podcast interview marketing show, I was so nervous, first off. And even my preparation and how I prepared to lead that discussion was vastly different. With a live presentation, well, first off, you usually have a visual aid, right? You're probably following a slideshow. You have some visual graphs or images to support your message. And you have a flow with that, right? You know what your next slide's going to be. You have some talking points. But with a podcast, as a host, especially, you are leading the discussion. You're thinking about pacing. You're thinking about, are we keeping on topic with the overarching theme? Keeping your guest on pace, on topic, not letting them veer off too much, while also making sure to consciously make it feel authentic and genuine, right? Without sounding like you're reading a script. And so that preparation was very different. And I will definitely say, yes, being a guest is so much easier. You just get to show up and talk, but as a host, you're like the producer in the background running, the director of keeping it on cue. So very different experience.
Somebody told me it's like a wedding, right? It's more fun to be the guest than the host of the wedding, right? You don't have to worry about all the details. You don't know everything that goes beyond there. And I think also not getting flustered. Right? We've all had different things, right? Just behind the curtain here, right? Kristen had a problem with her internet just before this, right? It's one thing when you're the guest. It's the other thing when you're the host. Tiffany has the sound of freedom going over, right? She lives right next to a naval air base, and you can tell when it's a sunny day, they're flying, right? And at times, you can see people just sort of cringe when the dog pushes open the door or whatever happens, right? You get a pop-up or something. And just to be able to work through that, right? The old joke, never let them see you sweat. Well, never let them see you cry. And even for mine, I can think of, I've been on a guest for over 1,000. it was so much different being a host because I've got to lead the conversation. I got to know where we're going. I've got to take off the plane. I've got to land it. And even little things like the calendar invite, right? If you've been a guest, you know that all you do is 5 minutes before the interview, while you're prepping, open up the calendar invite and hit that. And we use Riverside to record, and it takes you right there. And I was shocked the first time that I got in there and I clicked on the link, and we're both in there talking before we hit record. And then I just realized we're both guests. No one had the record button. And I was like, excuse me, I'll be right back. And it was just awkward there. But there's all those little things there, that you'll learn, right? And Tiffany, when you mentioned our first 5 episodes, I've got to go back and listen to those, because that's the other thing. Like we tell podcast guests, right? Your first episode is going to be your worst one. So get it out of the way. You'll learn. It will get better.
As we say, start ugly, right? And I think when we're doing lives, we did live discussions where I feel like there's almost an air of comfort there, because watch what happens live, right? I think people in our head, we think are more forgiving if the dog barks, right? Well, we're live. There's not a lot I can do. But with a recording, you think it should be a little bit more polished, right? You can't sweat. Nothing can go wrong. I cannot stumble my words. And so we got to find a good balance of being professional, being polished, but also realizing we are humans here having a conversation, and dogs bark occasionally, planes go by. There's nothing I can do about that. I talk to my husband. There's nothing he can do. But that's the nature of it. But I think that's also what people enjoy about podcasts too, is the best ones do feel authentic and like a genuine conversation. So it's okay. Things happen.
Cameron will clean it up in the editing.
Yes.
So having a good producer on your back end is very valuable, because we'll message him sometimes and be like, sorry, this one was really bad. Do your magic for us. And he's great. So good producer is definitely key. And a producer that understands your brand. He'll come to us sometimes and say he'll notice things that we don't, right? Because we're recording, we don't notice things. And he'll message and say, hey, I found this during this. I think it would be better to cut it out, right? Because he knows us and our brand and what we want to produce. And so you kind of have an outside set of eyes and ears looking out for you for those types of things, which is really beneficial.
That's interesting. Yeah, there's that relationship with the producer, the editor, whatever you want to say there. Once they know you better and better, they know what it's supposed to sound like. And sometimes they can save an interview, right? I can think of, we had one interview, where the mic flag was upside down, right? Our name was upside down in it, and how he did it, with the magic, and he corrected that, was beyond me. But, he saved that interview. That was great. I wanted to jump back to something, Tiffany. You would say, well, Tom is such a great public speaker, or does more of that. One of the most humbling things that I have found in speaking is when internally we do those things where we record all of our conversations on Fireflies, and it gives you a report. Who had the most filler words? Well, that's always me. And when we were doing the repurposing for an audiogram or the snippets, to see all the ums, uhs that you had to cut out, it was painful to watch.
Absolutely. And you don't realize it. I just said, I doing these repurposing things. I do a lot of, as the marketing manager, I do the repurposing and things for the show. And going through these episodes, you find that people are just more succinct in giving concise answers that are good at giving you those sound bites. And then others that are not so great at it. I've even had episodes where I'm like, oh, I felt like I did really good. And then I go back and try to do my own audiogram, which in and of itself is cringy to do, right? To pull out, like, let's see how awesome I am and pull out something that I said that was so great. But I realize sometimes I use almost like a comma in a sentence, and it is so cringy. You're like, I don't even want to create anything for that. I don't want to promote this. It's a great conversation if I could erase my 2,000 ums that I said. So I am actively working on it now that I'm aware of it. But otherwise, I never even knew that about myself. You know, listening to your game film, as we say, to get better each time.
Yeah, and I think with that, you know, being more self-aware and being on the podcast in different roles, I think it also makes you a little more aware of other things, right? I say like a ton. People always point it out. And so I also see some of the things like in my clients. So my experience on, you know, and doing this, I'm actually able to go to my clients and see it from a different lens. Whereas before I would just give them advice from, you know, a guest perspective. Whereas now I can see what it's like the other way. And so I can explain that to my clients. So that's one thing that I think has been really valuable to me, in that I'm able to kind of see both sides, both as a host and a guest, or as a production team and as a partner with my clients.
The other thing that I want to do more hosting with is because every interview I did, I learned something, right? I always learn from listening to podcasts, and, you know, some people will say Tom's the godfather of podcast interview marketing. They're just, yeah, you're just mentioning my age there, not my expertise. But to bring people on, and I hate to mention names because I'm probably going to miss half of them, right? Jeff Barch, you know, explained how to answer that first question better than I ever have, right? Arthur Joseph, the amazing man who's like, he's coached NFL players, their Hall of Fame speeches, and he's talking about how to prepare for the interview, and that I still take that loving breath before I start a podcast interview just to put myself in the right spot. Or Adrian McIntyre, right? The art of the anecdote. It's like, after I heard that, I'm like, I've been doing it wrong. So I think there's a benefit to hosting because you'll learn, you'll bring all these experts on. I think initially I thought, oh, we'll just share all of the information that we have internally, right? With the team, right? And we've got great expertise, but what's the old line from that Farmers Insurance? We know a lot because we've seen a lot. And we've seen so much from our clients. So when we learn something from a client, it's great to say, hey, would you be on the show? Right? We got Michelle Prince that's coming on to talk about the art of the soundbite.
I'm really excited about that one. I think it's going to be really great. You know, I know one thing that we've kind of talked about is, and I see this in listening to podcasts, is sometimes people will go on and on and on, right? They're asking you about yourself. You're going on for 3 minutes and people have turned you off. And so I think really having a concise answer and being able to speak in a shorter period of time allows for more dialogue. And I love that. And that's not something I'd previously considered. So I'm excited to learn more about that.
So as we wrap this up, if you were talking to yourself a year ago, right? Maybe somebody's listening here that's where we were a year ago, right? They're starting the podcast up. I don't say that we give them advice and say, you should do this. But if you were talking to yourself a year ago, what would you say?
I think for me, one thing to point out, you know, we've talked with some podcast guests who are looking to become a host. My key thing is to look at it like you're writing a book and you're trying to take it to a publisher. You can't show up with an obtuse idea of, I want to create a podcast and I want it to be the podcast interview marketing show and nothing else, right? The publisher is going to say, okay, I want an outline, and I probably might want the first 1 or 2 chapters done. So I would say go into it with that idea. You need 10, 20 solid episode ideas nailed down, identified in the can that are in line with the brand and the theme of the show. Have a plan of how you're going to implement that into your current workload with your team. Who's going to do what? How are you going to have a good framework for correspondence with guests, for publishing, for making sure that you were there every week publishing an episode for that consistency? So I would say having a really solid, like almost like a business plan, going into it, it's not like a frivolous idea of like, oh, I want to create this 5-page guide for, lead magnet, and I can knock that out in a week, right? There's a lot more that goes into it. So I would say look at it like you're taking a book outline to a publisher.
I would also say that going into it, adequate expectations, right? Like we kind of briefly touched on earlier. Sometimes people have an idea and they want to, dive right in and, see the fruits of their labor immediately, right? As we talked about, it takes time. We're not gonna record an episode today and publish it tomorrow. There's lots of, moving parts to it. So I think really just going in with the mindset that, it's not going to happen overnight. And I think being prepared, I always in my daily life, I want to be proactive versus reactive, right? So like, as you said, having, an adequate number of episodes ready to go. How often do you go onto Netflix and you watch a show and you're like, I need more of that. I want to watch that. I want to binge, the show. I think if you're doing things the right way, people are going to listen to you and say, this is great content. This is great information. I want to listen to 10 episodes, right? So they're just going to kind of have you, and that's really how you get people, hooked on your show, right? Like there's consistency there. And I think really understanding the processes and being polished, right? So we often hear, hey, Joe Smith has a podcast in his parents' basement. It's not well put together. It's probably not the best, brand representation, but your podcast that you're starting should be a reflection of you and your company and your brand, and it should be consistent. And so I think if I were to, say something to myself a year ago, I would say, just have adequate expectations and have fun, right? Like if you're having fun, then, it's enjoyable. If you're dreading, you're like my first couple of times I was the host. I mean, I was like sweating. I remember, like literally I'm like the beads of sweat are going to show in the camera. But as you kind of go through the process and you do it more often, it's like riding a bike, right? You gotta have the training wheels and then you just got to ride off into the sunset. So that's what I would say.
That's great. I guess the advice I would give is what one of my mentors, Dan Miller, would say. He's like, unless you're committed to doing it for a year, don't even start. And I look back on it, and if it was just me doing it, we would have had pod fade, right? I think having a team around you to support you, because it's like anything else. There's the ups, the downs, the roller coaster of that. If it was all on Kristen, boy, hurricanes would have taken that out. If it was all on other people, life happens. Doesn't matter if life happens. You have to get that episode out. So I think having that creativity, having that support, having that community not only makes it better, it makes it more consistent, and it makes it more fun. Tiffany, Kristen, thank you for a great first year. So excited for this next year. I know we've got ideas already. We've teased some of those there, but here's to a great second year of the Podcast Interview Marketing Show. What an incredible conversation today with both Tiffany and Kristen. I hope their insights into podcast production, planning, and the essential systems needed for consistency gave you a sense of what it takes to create a show that resonates with listeners and aligns with your brand. We talked about the importance of patience, preparation, and staying organized, especially when the unexpected happens, and it always does. As you think about your next steps, consider what they shared about setting realistic expectations and making sure your podcast or any appearance reflects the quality of your brand. Start with a plan And if you're thinking about podcasting, approach it like writing a book. Don't just jump in without laying that foundation. And remember, consistency builds trust. If you're consistent in showing up, your listeners will be consistent in showing up too. Thanks for joining us on this journey for the first year. Here's to another year of growth, learning, and impactful conversations. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to share it with someone who could benefit. And stay tuned for more episodes that will take your podcasting and your marketing to the next level.